The night was quiet, but the whispers were not. In a small American town, the kind of place where everyone's business is supposed to be known by everyone else, a secret grew in silence. A girl was carrying a child, but the question no one could answer, the question no one dared to ask, was who the father really was. And when the truth finally broke through the walls of gossip and denial, it wasn't just scandal that erupted, it was something far darker, something so forbidden that even now people lower their voices when they mention it. If they mention it at all. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The child became known much later as America's forbidden child. A life born not out of love but out of shadows, where the bloodline itself carried the curse of secrecy. Neighbors remembered the girl's pregnancy as a strange blur, her body changing, yet no man stepping forward, no proposal, no whispered promises of marriage. For months it was as if the father simply didn't exist. Some claimed he had vanished, others believed he was hidden among them, a familiar face cloaked in shame. But the truth was far more disturbing. The girl herself rarely spoke. When pressed by her family, she broke down into tears, but gave no names. The silence fed the rumors, and the rumors fed something much worse, because when no one knows, everyone begins to imagine. And in a town where history itself was tangled with old grudges, family feuds, and hushed sins, imagination often found its way to the darkest corners. Years later, as the story resurfaced in fragments, the pieces revealed something chilling. This wasn't just an unwanted pregnancy, it was a pregnancy no one was meant to talk about, a forbidden Nion buried in the soil of America's hidden past, where family ties twisted into something that should never have been. Even now, researchers, historians, and locals who dare to whisper it all agree on one thing. This was not just a scandal, it was the kind of secret that can rot an entire family tree from the inside out. And tonight, we peel back that history. The story begins in a farmhouse that had stood for over a century, its walls weathered, its floorboards creaking under the weight of generations. The girl, whose name I won't reveal yet, was born into a family that carried both respect and suspicion within the community. They were known for keeping to themselves, avoiding gatherings, and keeping their doors closed tighter than most. To outsiders it seemed odd, but in truth, they had much to hide. By the time she turned 16, the girl was already described as trapped. Neighbors noticed how rarely she was allowed out. School was never spoken of again after a certain point, and her chores became endless. There were whispers, rumors that her father, a man of cold authority, believed the family name had to be protected at all costs. But protect it from what? Some believed it was shame from past scandals, others believed it was something far darker, an obsession with bloodlines staying pure. It was in that suffocating house that the girl's belly began to swell. Slowly at first, as though nature itself was testing how long a secret could remain hidden, but soon there was no denying it. Her body betrayed the silence, and the neighbors began to talk. "Who's the father?" they asked in hushed voices, careful not to be heard too loudly. Some thought it must have been a farmhand, others suspected a traveling salesman. But as time went on, and no outsider appeared, suspicion turned inward. Within those walls, something was festering, and no amount of denial could hold it back forever. The family responded with fierce control. The girl was rarely seen outside anymore. Curtains remained drawn at odd hours of the day. When townsfolk visited, she was kept away, her swollen body hidden as though it were a crime. And the more they hid her, the clearer it became. They were not protecting her from the world. They were protecting themselves from the truth. What haunted the town was not just the mystery of the missing father, but the terrifying possibility that the father wasn't missing at all. He might have been right there, inside the house, sitting at the same table every night, carrying a family resemblance no one wanted to acknowledge. And as the birth drew near, that silence grew heavier, because once the child was born, there would be no more hiding. When the baby finally arrived, it was in the dead of night, behind locked doors, with no doctor present. The screams of labor were muffled by thick walls, and a family desperate to keep the neighbors from hearing. But sound has a way of slipping through, and several claimed they never forgot that night. The echo of a young girl's pain carried through the stillness like a haunting. The child's first cry should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it was met with fear. No one outside the home was invited to see the newborn, and for weeks, no one in town even knew if the baby had survived. When the truth emerged, it was unsettling. The child was frail, sickly, with features that many whispered looked too familiar. The resemblance wasn't to an outsider, but to someone within the family itself. This was the point where the town's unease turned into horror. Because if the rumors were true, if the father was indeed someone from inside that house, then the family hadn't just broken a moral code. They had crossed into something forbidden, something that history itself rarely dares to name. Doctors who later examined records suggested the child may have suffered from genetic complications, traits that often appear when bloodlines collapse in on themselves. The child's face carried a strange symmetry, his eyes a shade that mirrored his grandfather's. And while neighbors would never say it aloud, many believed they were looking at the living proof of an abomination. The girl, now a young mother, was broken. Her silence deepened, her eyes hollowed out, as though each glance toward her child carried both love and unbearable shame. She never admitted the truth, not to her closest friend, not even decades later when she was pressed by relatives who begged her to set the record straight. Her lips sealed the story tighter than any lock could. But the town did not forget. Dren grew up hearing fragments of the tale, how there had been a baby with no father, how the family buried the secret like a coffin beneath their fields, and those fragments grew into a legend, passed down in whispers, each telling darker than the last dot. Because what really haunts us is not just the fact that the baby was born. It's that no one could ever agree on who the father was, or rather, that everyone feared they already knew. As the years passed, the child grew but never quite thrived. There was always something fragile about him, as though he carried not just the weight of his own life, but the burden of the secret that had created him. His health was poor, illness struck him more often than other children, and when he did manage to join the others in play, whispers followed him like shadows. The family tried to present an image of normalcy. They dressed him neatly, sent him to school when they could, and insisted he was no different. But children have a cruel instinct for sensing difference, and classmates mocked him for his pale complexion, his awkward mannerisms, and most of all, for the mystery of his father. "Who's your daddy?" they taunted, not realizing how deep their question cut, or how close it came to exposing a truth that adults would never dare voice aloud. What made it worse was how fiercely the family defended their silence. Anytime the subject was raised, they deflected, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears. The girl, now a mother trapped in her own private prison, rarely looked anyone in the eye. Her father, the stern patriarch, grew more controlling than ever, ruling the house with an iron hand, as though the only way to keep the secret buried was to crush anyone who might speak it aloud. But rumors have a life of their own. They seep into conversations at church, in the general store, on the sidewalks where neighbors gather. Some swore they had seen the way the patriarch's eyes lingered on his daughter. Others recalled hearing arguments late at night, doors slamming, the sound of rage mixed with desperation. None of it was proven, but in a town that thrives on speculation, proof is often unnecessary. By the time the boy was 10, people stopped asking directly who his father was. They didn't need to. The resemblance had grown stronger with age, the jawline, the stare, the very shape of his hands. To outsiders, it was unmistakable. To insiders, it was unspeakable. And so, the child became a living ghost of a secret no one dared confirm. Every step he took was shadowed by the suspicion that he should never have existed at all. By the time adolescence arrived, the forbidden child was no longer a curiosity. He had become a reminder, a walking embodiment of everything the town tried to bury. People avoided his gaze, conversations shifted when he entered a room, and some even crossed the street to keep their distance. He wasn't treated as dangerous, but as cursed, as though acknowledging him too closely might invite the same shadow into their own homes. The boy himself seemed to sense it. Accounts from those who knew him describe a strange quietness, a tendency to linger in the background, watching more than speaking. He rarely laughed, and when he did, it startled those around him, like a sound that didn't belong. Some believed he knew the truth of his own origins. Others argued that he had simply absorbed the shame that wrapped around him like chains. What disturbed people most, however, was his resemblance to his mother's father, the man many believed to be the one person who could never be named as the father. The likeness was undeniable. In his posture, his stare, even in the way he furrowed his brow, the boy mirrored the patriarch who had ruled the family so fiercely. It was a resemblance that deepened with each passing year, making silence harder to maintain, and the whispers more venomous. Meanwhile, the girl who had become a mother remained trapped in her own torment. She aged quickly, her eyes always tired, her shoulders stooped as though the weight of the secret was physically breaking her down. Some said she never recovered from the night of her son's birth, that she was never allowed to. She carried guilt that may not even have been hers to carry. By this point, outsiders who came through the town would notice the strange undercurrent. They would ask simple questions about the family, about the boy, and receive only vague, clipped answers. The community had closed ranks, not to protect the child, but to protect themselves. Admitting the truth meant admitting that they had known all along, and sometimes silence is easier than complicity. But the forbidden child grew older, and with age came an unsettling reality. He could no longer be hidden. His very existence was proof of something unspeakable, and the older he became, the harder it was for the past to stay buried. As the boy entered his teenage years, the burden of the past pressed even harder against him. He was old enough now to ask questions, old enough to notice the silences, the glares, the way conversations stopped when he entered the room. But each time he tried to reach for an answer, the walls of denial slammed shut. His mother would only cry. His grandfather, the man everyone suspected, would grow cold and threatening. The truth was a ghost that haunted the home, visible everywhere but never allowed to be spoken. Neighbors began to avoid the subject altogether. The boy's resemblance to his grandfather was undeniable, but to say it aloud would have been to break a taboo deeper than any law. So they looked away. They whispered only behind closed doors, and in that silence the boy grew into a kind of exile, alive but not truly belonging anywhere. Some said he carried anger within him, a quiet storm that built over the years. Others believed he had resigned himself to his fate, accepting that he was born from something cursed and could never change it. Whichever was true, his presence became a mirror for the town itself. Every time they saw him, they were forced to confront the darkness they had chosen to ignore. By the time he was 17, the unspoken secret was almost unbearable. People described feeling a tension in the air whenever the boy and his grandfather were seen together, as if everyone in the room shared the same thought, but no one dared let it slip. That kind of silence is more powerful than any confession. It binds people in complicity. It rots the soul of a community. And here's where I want to pause for a moment. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out or stayed silent like the rest of the town? Because this silence carried contours, sequences. Secrets never stay buried forever. And when the truth finally claws its way to the surface, it doesn't just destroy the guilty, it consumes everyone who chose to look the other way. The question was never just about who fathered the child. The question was, how long could an entire community live with a truth it refused to speak? The years rolled on, and the forbidden child became a man. Yet, even adulthood could not free him from the chains of his origin. He carried his family's shadow with him everywhere he went. Some said he left town for a time, trying to carve out a life where no one knew his story. But small towns have long memories, and secrets have a way of traveling faster than truth. Wherever he went, whispers seemed to follow. The man's health never fully recovered from the weaknesses of his childhood. He was prone to bouts of illness, his body carrying the silent toll of the blood that had created him. But perhaps what weighed on him most was not physical but psychological. The knowledge or suspicion of who had fathered him became an unbearable burden. It was a truth that hollowed him from the inside, leaving him restless, unstable, unable to ever feel truly whole. Meanwhile, his mother remained locked in sorrow. By then she was no longer a girl, but a woman weathered by time, her face lined far beyond her years. People who saw her described her as haunted, as though she walked through life half alive. She never remarried, never sought happiness. To her, love was a wound that could not heal. The patriarch, the man whose name was never spoken aloud as the possible father, aged 2. Yet even in his final years, he carried himself with the same cold authority, the same silence that had shielded the family for decades. He never confessed, he never faltered. And when he was finally laid to rest, many believed he carried the truth to the grave with him. But the truth did not die, because it was alive in the eyes of the forbidden child. It was alive in the stares of those who remembered, in the records that hinted at missing pieces, in the local stories that became darker with every retelling. This is the curse of secrets. They do not vanish, they echo. And in America's hidden corner, stories like this one are not isolated. They are fragments of a larger, forbidden history, a history of families who locked their doors, silenced their children, and prayed that their neighbors never spoke the words they all feared were true. And yet, every generation, those words find their way back. In the end, the story of America's forbidden child is not just about one girl, one father, or one boy born into silence. It is about the terrible weight of secrets and how they poison not only the family who carries them, but the entire community that chooses to ignore them. This child, who never asked to be born, became a symbol of everything a town tried to erase, and in their effort to bury the truth, they only ensured it would echo louder for generations to come. What makes this story so haunting is not the scandal itself, but the way it mirrors countless hidden histories across the country. Families with locked doors and whispered tragedies, children whose very existence raises questions no one dares answer, entire bloodlines shaped by silence, fear, and shame. The truth is, America is filled with forgotten stories like this one, stories your grandfather might have refused to talk about, stories your grandmother might have buried with her. The forbidden child grew old, but never escaped his origins. Some say he lived quietly until the end of his days, keeping to himself, carrying his secret like a scar across his soul. Others claim he left behind fragments, letters, confessions, small traces that point toward the truth but never confirm it. Perhaps that's fitting, because the most disturbing truths are never fully revealed. They are left hanging, forcing us to imagine the worst, to fill in the blanks with our darkest suspicions. And that is why we remember him. Not as a name, not even as a face, but as a reminder. A reminder of what happens when silence replaces justice, when bloodlines twist into something unnatural, when entire communities choose to look away instead of speak out. So the next time you pass an old farmhouse, boarded up and quiet, ask yourself, what secrets are still locked inside? What lives were shaped by truths no one was ever meant to know? Because some histories aren't written in books, they live in whispers, they hide in family trees, and sometimes they're buried in plain sight. This was the story of America's forbidden child, a secret the world was never supposed to hear,